Thanks. Well, what we're talking about here is a €12 billion fund to effectively raise the walls of Fortress Europe. Fortress Europe with its militarised borders, Fortress Europe with its plans to spend some of that money on giving it to so-called third countries with dubious human rights records, with records of repression of opponents, and repression of the Kurds, for example, in the case of Turkey, to pay these countries to take some asylum seekers that come to Europe. Fortress Europe, a system that is responsible last year for the death of over 2,000 people. Over 2,000 people died in the Mediterranean. We all hopefully remember the picture of the 2-year-old boy, Aylan Kurdi, washed up on a beach. People saw in him their own children and thought, this is horrific, we can't allow this to happen. Not only is it continuing to happen, it's getting worse, and it's funded by our public money. What we're seeing in Europe and what we're seeing in this country is a ramping up of anti-migrant policies, anti-migrant and racist rhetoric. To be clear, not policies that will make the lives of any ordinary person here any better, not at all. It's just purely performative cruelty. You pretty much can't turn on the radio these days without hearing the government announce some new policy to attack migrants, to make their lives harder. We now have embedded journalists on deportation charter flights. There hasn't been a single deportation flight that our Minister for Justice hasn't tweeted gleefully about. It is disgusting. Policy after policy to make people's lives harder, cutting the accommodation recognition payment, cutting the accommodation for Ukrainians, leaving asylum seekers on the streets when there were empty beds and continue to be empty beds in the system, snatching families for deportation, now making asylum seekers pay up to €1,000 for a month for completely inadequate accommodation. What's all this about? Well, actually, Jim Deasy in the Sunday Business Post at the weekend gave the game away, and people should be aware about this. People should go and read this article. The article is entitled, John Deasy, a former Fine Gael TD, Opposition Parties Bet on Housing Backlash, Yet Voters Keep Calling Their Bluff. Quote, people certainly don't become indifferent to society's most pressing problems that continue to cause huge pain. But they do become less politically responsive when they've heard the same thing said over and over again. Other issues invariably come to the fore and compete for their attention. The issue of immigration is doing just that. By the time the next election rolls around, housing could find itself on a par with immigration as the big concern in Conservative Ireland. If that happens, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael will be in a better position to muffle the inevitable accusations of failure on housing and infrastructure. There you have it in black and white. You are implementing cruel policies against migrants because you want to problematise the issue of immigration. You want people to think that there's a flood of asylum seekers coming into this country, when in reality the numbers have come down and down and down. 2022, asylum seekers and refugees about 80,000. That was half the next year. It was almost half the following year. It'll be just over 20,000 in this year. They're not the cause of the housing crisis. This is a trick that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael and the establishment parties, and assisted by lots of the media, are trying to pull on people. People should not fall for it. The problems remain the same as they were before. Those responsible remain the same as those that were before. Those who profit from these crises, and the government that facilitates.
Deputy Michael Collins.